Taliban would then quickly march into Kabul, and we would get a chance to find out what chaos presents in Afghanistan. That's not a social science experiment I would personally like to run. I think it's important to note that the great majority of the money required to keep the Afghan national security forces in the field comes from outside. Their operating budget annually is more than twice the entire domestic revenue of the Afghan government. If that outside support to the Afghan security forces were to stop, their ability to sustain a stalemate, much less do better, I think would go away quite quickly.
Thank you, gentlemen. You're back.
Mr. Langevin, you're next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you. So let me start with Dr. Jones. First, I want to thank all of our panelists for testifying today. But Dr. Jones, I'd like to go back to the chairman's question. If I understood it right, he seemed to say that if we stay, there could be chaos. If we withdraw, there could be chaos. So it's just one kind of chaos for another, and that we were caught off guard, not anticipating the plotting, the planning that was going on before 9/11, and that do we really think that kind of thing could go on again without us knowing? So if I understood that question the right way, what my question is, if we are not there and we do withdraw precipitously, how would we know with adequate fidelity whether Al-Qaeda or any other terrorist organization is plotting or planning against us? And without a presence there, how could we respond effectively and know exactly where to hit? I know that we would certainly engage still in intelligence gathering with our partner agencies, but would we know enough how and where to adequately be able to respond should there be a growing threat to America or our allies?
Thank you. Very, very good questions on the chairman's on the discussion with the chairman. My response was essentially that while I wouldn't characterize necessarily the situation as chaos now. I mean, there is a war, but I think were the U.S. to withdraw, it would significantly worsen. I mean, it is worth pointing out that the Taliban controls not a single major city right now, and compare that, say, 2014, 2015, 2016 to Iraq and Syria, where the Islamic State controlled Raqqa and Fallujah and Ramadi and Mosul. The Taliban controls zero cities right now. So I think it's worth noting that that would change, I think. My assessment is that would change with the U.S. withdrawal. How would we know, you ask? It would become a lot more difficult. Obviously, as you noted, the U.S. would have some intelligence collection capabilities, but it would be much more difficult to understand what Al-Qaeda was doing, what the Taliban, what other militant groups were doing in Afghanistan without a military, CIA, NSA meaningful presence in the country.
Yeah. And I would agree with that. That would be my interpretation as well. Ambassador Crocker, the U.S. Taliban agreement commits the Taliban to preventing any groups, including Al-Qaeda, from using Afghan soil to threaten the security of the United States or its allies. So what would the verification mechanism be to ensure the Taliban are compliant? And would a troop reduction impact our ability to ensure the Taliban are compliant?
Thank you for that excellent question. The Taliban has no intention and, in their view, no need to make good on any of their commitments. They'll say what we want to hear, but they know that we're going home as these negotiations are currently structured. And again, the president's latest decision to cut by half our small remaining force tells the Taliban all they need to know about our staying power and our willingness to continue our support and our presence in Afghanistan. So unless or until the whole so-called peace process effort is restructured, to show that we are serious about this, that if they do not live up to their basic commitments, we are not going away. If there's a single phrase that I would commend to this committee on what we need strategic patience. The Taliban and Al Qaeda have that strategic patience. They believe they can outlast us, and we are proving them right. We have got to say, and we've got to show that we do have the will to stay a course until we see circumstances in Afghanistan that warrant further withdrawals.
Very good. Thank you very much to all of our panelists. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Byrne, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been great morning. So I'm not an expert on this issue like the three of you are, but I'm an expert on what the people in my district think. We all are. That's how we got here. And I don't think what the people in my district think is much off of what the people in America in general think on this issue. The people of my district are tired of nation building in Afghanistan. They think 19 years, thousands of lives, American lives lost, all these injuries, all these hundreds of thousands of servicemen and women lives disrupted, obviously billions and billions and billions of dollars, enough. So I think they're not for nation building anymore. We've done great things. Ambassador Crocker's made a great point about all that. But my folks think we've done enough. Now, I think they probably would support a continuing counterterrorism effort, okay? They don't want Al Qaeda to get back in control there. So when you talk about the drawdown, the question in my mind is, what's the right number? Can we have a successful counterterrorism effort with 2,500 versus 5,000 troops there? And Dr. Jones, I'll start with you and ask you that question.
That's really the $64,000 question. And let me say,
it's a lot more than that.
Yeah, that's probably true. The $64 billion question,
yeah.
Maybe. I'm tired of nation building. We're well beyond that. And I don't think anybody, as you note, is talking about anything close to the 100,000 forces we had in Afghanistan in 2009. What I would say is the question I think that we need to ask our military leadership is 2,500 enough to prevent a Taliban overthrow of the government? For me, it's not just a counterterrorism issue. It is also a prevention of the overthrow of the government. And so what does 2,500 give us versus something closer to 4,500 or 5,000? That's a question for General Miller. That's a question for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And I think that's where I would come back to. I think, again, I would say it's more than just killing or capturing al-Qaeda leaders. It is also, do we want to prevent the overthrow of the government, and how can we continue to sustain and support the Afghan government to do the fighting and dying?
Well, I think I know the answer to this, but let me ask it because I think it's a fundamental question. Is it a given, if the Taliban take back over again, that they will allow the country to be a harbor for al-Qaeda? However much they hate ISIS, I think they still like al-Qaeda. Will they allow al-Qaeda to be harbored again?
I would answer that in two ways. One is the UN assessments in 2020 have been unambiguous on this, that they continue to have strategic, operational, and tactical level. The Taliban has strategic, operational, and tactical level relations with al-Qaeda, al-Qaeda Senior, and al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent. And I think we've also seen local Taliban commanders have been willing to give sanctuary to al-Qaeda leaders in areas that they control. So I think the answer there is yes, we will continue to see Taliban-al-Qaeda relations in the future.
On that last question, Dr. Biddle, what is your opinion?
Yeah, I would agree with my colleague, Dr. Jones. It's a mistake to separate counterterrorism and the survival of the Afghan government. If the Afghan government falls and the Taliban take over, or there's simply a chaotic civil war, the terrorism threat from Afghanistan will go substantially up, and the ability of a handful of American troops operating from a handful of bases that will look like besieged Fort Disaster in the middle of a catastrophe will be very, very limited. Worse still, the security of Afghanistan's neighbors will be importantly implicated, and especially the security of a nuclear-armed Pakistan. In the event that chaos in Afghanistan flows across the border in the aftermath of a government collapse, We then have the potential for militant groups in Pakistan, if that government falls, getting their hands on actual usable nuclear weapons. So I think the tendency to say what we really want is counterterrorism, let's forget all of this counterinsurgency to protect the government, is a false dichotomy in very important ways.
Very quickly, Ambassador Crocker, on that last question.
I share that view, We've seen this movie before. We were heavily engaged with the Pakistanis and Afghan fighters throughout the decade of the 1980s to expel the Soviets. We succeeded, and then we walked out. What did we get? The Afghan Civil War, the rise of the Taliban, and the road to 9/11. It would be folly to think it's somehow going to be magically different this time if we walk out. As my colleagues have said, there is no doubt about the link between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Again, the Taliban gave up the country for Al-Qaeda.
I apologize, Ambassador, but the gentleman's time has expired. To move on. Mr. Garamendi, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the witnesses, thank you very much. To my colleagues for their questions, you're providing some really good questions and good insight into the situation. Hopefully I can do the same. I'm looking at all of you have argued for the presence of American troops somewhat higher than 2,500 for the purposes of securing a negotiated settlement between the Taliban and the Afghan government. Could you please describe what that settlement would look like? What exactly do we want to see? How will the Taliban and the Afghan government merge into some sort of a reconciliation? Let's start with Mr. Jones, and then we'll go Crocker and end with Biddle.
Thank you very much for the question. I mean, I think it is important to ask very specifically what a settlement might look like. And obviously, it's at this point with negotiations just starting in September, it's difficult to predict where they might go. But I think what we have seen in those Taliban that have defected and come to the Afghan government side is a willingness to participate in the political process. I think what we'd probably have to see is some compromise on both sides on issues including power sharing arrangements, key ministries, including security services. I think one would ideally want to see Taliban allowed, as they have been in some other wars, think of El Salvador or even Colombia, where there was a peace deal, demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration of fighters, in some cases potentially into the government security services. I think there also has to be some discussion on the Afghan constitution, the role of Islam in the constitution. So I think the issue is, can we get to a place where the Afghan government and the Taliban can compromise on a range of these types of issues and get support from their constituencies, which will be hard. And I think there is room for bargaining.
I'm going to interrupt you. I have just a few moments, so a short answer would be necessary here. Let's go on, Mr. Biddle.
Yeah, I think the nature of the bargaining space here is that the Taliban would have to give up several things. They'd have to break with Al-Qaeda, they'd have to renounce violence, they'd have to disarm, and they'd have to accept some variation of today's Afghan constitution. That's a lot, but it's plausible. We would have to give up a lot. We would have to legalize the Taliban as a political actor in Afghanistan. We would have to agree to withdraw all foreign troops, including our counterterrorism presence, unless the Afghan government asked us to stay to train their troops to defend their own borders. And we would have to provide the Taliban with some sort of set-aside of guaranteed offices in the Afghan government, guaranteed seats in the Afghan parliament. They know they're unpopular. If all we're doing is offering to let them run for election in ways they know they would lose, they won't agree to a deal. Where Turkey will be talked is over what kind of set-aside. How big? What will the power sharing look like? What version of the Afghan constitution will we get? But I think that's what the general bargaining space within which a deal would be cast looks like.
Thank you. Ambassador Crocker. Ambassador, your thoughts on this? What is a negotiated settlement? Apparently, Ambassador Crocker is not available.
I think we lost him for one reason or another. We'll work on that. Go ahead, John.
The next question really is one that we need to consider. It's been said a couple of times, and that is the neighborhood is also involved. We haven't talked much about the neighborhood. Could you do so in, 15-second spots here, starting with Mr. Biddle?
15 seconds on the neighborhood. The most important neighbor is Pakistan. They're a nuclear-armed country that's fighting a civil war at the moment. That civil war could go badly for them if it does, and the prospects of that would go up a lot if the government in Kabul collapsed. Then you could have a failed state with nuclear weapons running around and lots of militants that don't like us any more than they like them.
I should not have asked for 15 seconds.
I could go on longer if you wish. That's up to you.
Let's go, Jones.
Agree with Dr. Biddle. Pakistan is the primary supporter of the Taliban. It's where its leadership structure is located. Taliban also does receive some assistance from Iran and Russia, among others.
Thank you.
So in my final 5 seconds here, I'm
has
just
expired.
going to say that we need to consider the neighborhood in all of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Hartzler is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the questions of my colleagues about the status of the women in Afghanistan. I had the privilege of traveling with Representative Davis. We're going to miss you. But on one of those trips and met with many of the women who are now in Parliament and heard some of the stories of what life was like when Taliban was in charge. And so I am very concerned about that. But since there's already been some questions asked about that, I wanted to move on, start with Mr. Biddle, talking about the status of the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. We have invested in them for years, and I would like you and the other witnesses to kind of summarize in your mind the progress that has been made in their abilities, and do you envision a future where the Afghan security forces are self-sustaining, and what level of support or time commitment should the United States provide to ensure Afghanistan has adequate defense forces? And along with that goes along with our assistance. Should the United States and the international community continue to provide military and economic assistance, specifically economic assistance to Afghanistan into the future? So I know there's several questions there, but Mr. Biddle, if you could start, that would be great.
Time permitting, I'm on the pessimistic end of the spectrum of opinion on the prognosis for the Afghan National Security Forces. I think what we see with a lot of forces of this kind in the developing world, not just in Afghanistan, is in weakly institutionalized political settings where you don't have a judiciary, you don't have courts, you don't have police that can resolve conflicts between armed elites. The government is required to maintain an internal balance of power in which it cannot allow its own military to get too strong, because it threatens other warlords and armed actors within the elite broadly defined, and that's a bigger threat to the government usually than an insurgency is. What that means is you end up with corruption and cronyism as tools to control the threat that the national military poses to armed elites within the regime broadly defined, and that is a profound, systematic, deeply rooted limiter on the combat potential of the Afghan security forces and forces in similar countries elsewhere in their ability to actually defeat an insurgency. I think they are strong enough to maintain a slowly decaying stalemate. There are almost 300,000 of them in the country, after all, at the moment. I don't think they're a plausible capability for defeating the insurgency, regardless of plausible levels of U.S. support. Now, in terms of U.S. aid moving forward, I think the primary role for U.S. aid moving forward, once we get before a settlement, is to keep the Afghan forces in the field and maintaining a stalemate. Without our support, they can't do that. After a settlement, aid will be required as a way of enforcing the terms of the settlement. The presence or absence of outside aid is the critical tool to get a power-shared government in which the Taliban will play a role to behave itself and observe the terms of the agreement. Therefore, some kind of international aid is going to be necessary in the long term. Nothing like the current scale, but a complete shutdown of U.S. aid, even if we get a settlement, will lead to a collapse of the settlement because we will lose our leverage to enforce its terms.
Let me follow up real quickly before we go to Dr. Jones. You mentioned the courts. So when I was there in 2011, we visited with our Department of Justice, and officials from the State Department were there actually helping them set up their court system, and it was progressing. What would you say is the status of the courts? You indicated that you think there is no ability of the courts to maintain justice. Could you expound on that, please?
I think the courts are better than they were, but they have the fundamental limit of their inability to enforce adjudication of disputes on armed members of the elite. We've seen over and over again that the kind of grand mal corruption that's used to maintain this internal balance of power within the Afghan elite, broadly defined, is largely beyond the ability of the courts and the judicial system to solve. When Afghan power brokers are accused of corruption and evidence is presented, the judiciary system, as a general rule, has been unable to enforce its will on them.
Thank you.
And I don't think that's surprising.
Thank you. 30 seconds, Dr. Jones. Can you expound on any of these topics?
Yes. Actually, just briefly, starting with women, I think we've also seen the Taliban in areas they control today, not just in the 1990s, oppressive of women. So their track record today is not very good. I think the area where we've seen the most success on Afghan National Defense and Security Forces has been the commandos, roughly the 20,000 commandos. And I think the important lesson here is that's been sustained U.S. training from Special Operations Forces. Those are the best. They're the best trained. They're the most consistently trained, and that's where I think we've had the most success.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yield back.
Mr. Norcross is recognized for 5 minutes, and I believe we do have Mr. Crocker back. So if you wish to ask questions, Mr. Crocker, you can do that as well. Mr. Norcross.
Thank you, Chairman. This is directed to the ambassador. The 15th of January is the date by which the report has the withdrawal of the troops. What strategic advantage, if any, did we achieve, or what are we getting in response for the drawdown, in your opinion?
We are getting nothing in response to that drawdown. That has been the problem with these talks from the beginning. By sitting down with the Taliban without the Afghan government in the room, they knew from the start that this is a negotiation on the terms of our surrender. And everything that has happened since, I think, has validated that view in the eyes of the Taliban. So they will continue to press their offensive, and we will continue to withdraw. That is not a staged, reasoned step. It's frankly cutting our force in half in 2 months. That is a rout.
So that brings me to the next question for Dr. Biddle. One of the 4 pillars, and the one obviously, in my opinion, is so critical, is harboring terrorists. We've seen so many times throughout our history the plausible deniability. I had no idea they were there. In your opinion, how does one enforce or obtain true information that's verifiable whether they're harboring terrorists? And that's a relative question.
Yeah, there are 2 pieces to that. There's the intelligence problem of figuring out whether they're behaving themselves, whether they're complying with the terms of whatever agreement we eventually reach. And then there's the issue of leverage if we decide that they are not complying to force them back into compliance. On the intelligence side of this, it's partly a function of the intelligence mechanisms of the U.S. government, but it's also in part a function of the intelligence mechanisms of Afghans who oppose the Taliban within a power-sharing regime. If we get some sort of settlement, it won't involve a Taliban takeover. If what we end up with is a surrender instrument for us, then of course we will offer no aid to support that kind of a deal. If we're talking about a deal that's in our interest and that we're willing to support, it will involve power sharing in which we retain allies within the Afghan government who would have an incentive to report to us violations of the agreement by the Taliban. That, coupled with our own intelligence, is necessary for us to know whether the agreement is being violated. If it's violated, our leverage to bring them back into compliance is aid. That's one of the reasons why I think continued aid is essential if any agreement we reach is going to be stable.
Thank you. So, Dr. Jones, let's bring this back to the end. Does Taliban control automatically equal a terrorist, an existential threat of some sort to the United States. Existential is too far, but a threat to the United States, either they directly or through them allowing other groups to come back in, does that automatically mean they're going to look at the United States for some sort of an additional attack?
Well, I think it's important to differentiate types of terrorist organizations. The Taliban has been committed to conducting attacks against the Islamic State, Khorasan province, in Afghan provinces such as Kunar and Nangarhar. So I think we could expect the Taliban to fight those kinds of organizations, but those are a minority. I think based on the relationship today between the Taliban and al-Qaeda at the strategic, operational, and tactical levels, I think we could expect over time that the U.S. national security interests are threatened based on international and regional terrorist groups operating in Afghanistan, including al-Qaeda.
So assuming that, maybe not immediately, that we are going to be back in the same situation, what does that new Afghanistan look like in terms of troops? Obviously, after the Second World War, we're not looking at Germany, but certainly we've been prepared for Russia and the Soviet Union. Are we potentially looking at long-term presence in order to keep in check those who do us harm?
So my answer,
Dr. Jones.
my answer to that is until there is a peace agreement or something else that weakens the Taliban, yes, I think my judgment would be a continuing U.S. military presence, a small presence that's able to fight against these and weaken these organizations.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Stefanik is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Jones, I represent Fort Drum, which is home of the 10th Mountain Division, which you know is the most deployed division in the U.S. Army since 9/11 to Afghanistan. Currently, the division headquarters and members of the 1st Brigade Combat Team are operating in Afghanistan, with the 2nd Brigade Combat Team on schedule to deploy to the region throughout this fall. I want to wish our 10th Mountain soldiers a very happy Thanksgiving. I know this is not the first Thanksgiving for many of them who are away from their friends and family at home. Given your experience advising military commanders, how can we balance the reduction of forces in Afghanistan with the necessary force protection measures to ensure that our remaining troops that are in country are protected and able to safely conduct their daily operations and missions? I want to ensure that we're keeping force protection to the absolute highest level.
Force protection is obviously essential, so as are logistics, and there are other components of that. So I think the question when we talk about numbers is, as you're implying, I think, it's not just the number of counterterrorism forces that are striking targets or arresting or even training Afghan terrorists or training Afghan commandos to target terrorist organizations like al-Qaeda, but it's also the force protection at bases that's necessary. That may be military police and others to secure bases. On any of the bases that I've ever served on, we've also hired local Afghans to provide basic protection, and in some cases contractors as well. So that does need to be added to the mix of the force posture we're talking about.
And then in your written statement, you mentioned a troop drawdown's impact on our ability to conduct the train, advise, and assist mission and conduct CT missions and operations and collect intelligence. What overall does this mean for the resurgence and strengthening of terror groups in Afghanistan, particularly in reference to potential difficulties we may have when it comes to conducting CT? Does this put us in a similar situation that we faced in Iraq in 2011 to 2014, in which we will be back in Afghanistan down the road to combat stronger, more organized terrorist groups that threaten us?
Well, I don't think it entirely puts us back to 2011 where we pulled all forces out, but we are now taking a risk by going down to 2,500. What it means, I think, is that that force posture may be enough to conduct strikes against terrorists, but we're going to have to move a range of our train, advise, and assist trainers from the Kandak level, from the Afghan Air Force, up to the Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Interior level. So what we lose is the ability to train Afghans at the operational and tactical level, actually where the fight is happening. So that means it's a risk to the state of the war, and I think that's where we're at right now, and that's where we're going to accept some risk.
Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Gallego is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I defer to my colleague, Representative Crow.
Thank you, Mr. Gallego, for yielding your time to me. Everyone here today has spoken about the need to address the threat, and I think there's universal agreement that there is indeed a threat in Afghanistan. But the fact of the matter is we face a lot of threats, we have a lot of adversaries, and we do so with limited resources. So because we have to take a holistic view and make decisions about those limited resources, there are ultimately trade-offs and opportunity costs to that. I went to war after 9/11 3 times, twice in Afghanistan, and fought the Taliban because I do take seriously our charge to keep our country safe and our responsibility to respond to those threats. But I also know that we face domestic terror threats that we haven't adequately addressed, that over 1,000 Americans a day are dying of COVID-19 because we are not adequately addressing that. Over 50,000 Americans a year are dying by opioids because we are not adequately addressing that, and over 20 veterans a day are dying because we are not addressing that threat and that need as well. But this isn't a philosophical discussion about the value that we place on different threats. It's a practical one. And what I believe is that we do have to draw down for the reasons that many of my colleagues have articulated before, but there is a right way to do it and there is a wrong way to do it. From my perspective, the administration's process has been largely a black box. It's changed, and we don't have sufficient information, and we can't have a discussion as a body here and as an American public about the process and the relative risks. So from your perspective, very briefly, starting with Dr. Jones, since you're here, going to Ambassador Crocker and then to Mr. Biddle, do you believe that America would benefit from a more transparent process like the one that we outlined in the National Defense Authorization Act, a provision that would require broader engagement with Congress and our partners so we better understand those threats and the proper way to draw down?
Yes, very briefly, I think it is always better to have a transparent process where we have any administration outline what its objectives are in places like Afghanistan and what is the force posture necessary to meet those objectives, as well as the diplomatic presence, intelligence presence, and others. Yes.
Thank you. Ambassador Crocker?
Thank you. We are a great democracy, and the greatness of our democracy depends on the transparency of an administration. The American people will sacrifice a lot and deal with a lot of hardship if they understand why they're being asked to make some of these sacrifices. So I would hope that there will be an effort in the coming months for the new administration to articulate precisely that. What are the stakes in Afghanistan? Why are we there? I think those are questions that we can answer and have answered in this committee. But the case needs to be made and made repeatedly.
And very briefly, Mr. Biddle, because I do have one more question, but I'd love your thoughts on that first question.
Transparency is key. A democracy waging a war is engaging in policies that take lives in the name of the state and spend billions of dollars of public treasury. We owe it to the public to debate this publicly, to build a consensus behind whatever policy we adopt, and I commend the committee for its role in further debate with today's hearings.
Thank you. My last question is, America is strong just not because of our power and our military, but because we have friends. We have friends and allies. That has an outsized impact, not just on Afghanistan, but in every way that we're engaged. And I'm extremely concerned that there hasn't been consultation with our NATO partners. 38 partners and allies have committed to the U.S.-led NATO mission. And they, by my estimation, have not been given adequate information about what we're trying to do. In fact, as you mentioned, Dr. Jones, Article 5 has only been invoked after 9/11. And there was always an estimation that we would go in together and come out together. So very briefly, each of you, 15 seconds on the impact on the NATO alliance of not adequately consulting with them.
Well, I think it makes it hard, not consulting with allies makes it harder for them to make a case to their own populations to keep a presence in Afghanistan that we need because it provides additional value to us.
Thank you. Ambassador Crocker.
Clearly, we have got to do a better job of communicating with our strategic partners in NATO. We've seen the statement of the Secretary General of NATO this past week after the President's announcement, expressing his distress over where we're going and how we're doing it. So yes, NATO has stood up for us in Afghanistan. They are with us there now. They need to hear from us that we will stay the course.
Thank you. Mr. Biddle, very briefly.
Our alliance system is one of the great grand strategic advantages of the United States relative to our primary competitors in China and Russia, neither of whom enjoys the alliance system that the United States enjoys. Respect for our allies enables us to take advantage of the things that this alliance system brings to the table. We should further that critical grand strategic advantage by taking our allies seriously and consulting them to the greatest degree possible.
Thank you. Thank you again to Mr. Gallego for yielding me his time. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Crow. Mr. Gates is next for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And not only am I a minority member of this committee, I hold a minority view on the war in Afghanistan on the committee. I'm against it. Based on even the words of our own witnesses today, the corruption in Afghanistan is unsolvable. The war is unwinnable, and the strategy is indecipherable. It's not a criticism of the current administration. These are conditions that have been present for the last 19 years as we've traded the same villages back and forth with the Taliban. I listened intently as Dr. Biddle said, well, we're leaving and we're getting nothing. What we're getting is out. To me, the biggest loser in Afghanistan is the nation that stays the longest. Now, as I read some of the prepared testimony of our witnesses, particularly Dr. Biddle, here's how the argument seems to go. 2,500 troops really has no military value. There is no technical capability with 2,500 troops that we have that is going to fundamentally win this war. We've had 100,000 troops there and we couldn't win it. And now we think with 2,500, that's what's going to preserve these alliances and ensure our allies that we're really there with sufficient grit. But that the purpose of these 2,500 troops is politics, that it is a political feature of the war in Afghanistan, that if we leave 2,500 troops there, we will get more leverage. And that if we engage in accelerated drawdowns, well, the Afghans, the Taliban in particular, will see that this is sort of a war of attrition that the United States is going to lose. And so they're just going to stick there and maintain a level of violence that allows them to potentially recapture their political power. But the obvious question is, if we know that the 2,500 troops we're leaving there don't have military value and are there as a political statement, probably the enemy knows that too. Probably they understand the very dynamics that our witnesses have laid out through their testimony today, that this only ends one way, with us leaving, with the Taliban getting more power, and with conditions in Afghanistan in pretty rough shape going forward, as they have been for the last 2 decades, as they were for a substantial period of time before that. I'm grateful that in the Trump administration we have highlighted our near-peer adversaries as the requisite focus for our work. I'm glad that we don't believe we have to chase every potential terrorist into every potential cave in Whereveristan so that we can, thump our chests and say that we're being tough with a global counterterrorism mission. It is my sincere hope that we not only reduce our troop levels to 2,500, but that we reduce them to 0, that we leave Afghanistan. This has been the longest war in our nation's history. Our country is weary of it, even if the Armed Services Committee is not. And I yield back.
Mr. Moulton, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Having served 4 tours in Iraq, there's no one who wants to bring the troops home more. But if there's one lesson we've learned over the last 20 years, it's harder to get out of these wars than to get in. And we leaving willy-nilly without any plan without any leverage is clearly the wrong thing to do, according to every witness, Republican and Democrat, before this committee. I want to end the war in Afghanistan, but I want to end it responsibly. And more importantly, I want to bring the troops home for good. I do not want to repeat the mistake we made in Iraq, where we withdrew so quickly without sufficient plans that we had to turn around and go back in. And although I think all of our witnesses also agree that we are not going to, quote unquote, win the war in Afghanistan, frankly, that's not on the table and hasn't been for a long time now. There are very devastating ways that we could lose. Most of all, of course, a repeat of 9/11. Mr. Ambassador Crocker, I would like to ask you a question about another way that we could lose, which is that there are 2 Americans that we suspect are being held hostage in Afghanistan and Pakistan by groups with close ties to the Taliban, Paul Overby, an author for Massachusetts, and Mark Frericks, a Navy veteran and defense contractor. As this administration proceeds with plans to withdraw troops early and without any concessions from the Taliban, there's no indication that Mr. Overby or Mr. Frericks' release and safe return are being considered in diplomatic negotiations or required as a precondition for an accelerated drawdown. In your experience and opinion, what are important factors to consider in securing the release of these 2 Americans? And if we withdraw troops earlier than anticipated, what other potential leverage do we have to ensure that Mr. Overby and Mr. Frericks are returned safely to their families?
Thank you, Congressman. As with these sad cases, we I think see another illustration of what we're giving up by giving up our leverage, and we are certainly doing that by unilateral troop withdrawals that require nothing of the Taliban. They have no incentive to cooperate at any scale or on any level, and that would impact both from the top strategic level of support for the government and its survivability in Afghanistan, and it goes down to this level as well. It is pretty hard to get something if you have given up your leverage. There is no incentive for the Taliban, who we presume are holding these 2 Americans, to take any steps to release them. So again, if you are programmed for defeat, which we seem to be, you have no leverage and no expectation that we will gain anything, including the release of these 2 Americans.
Well, certainly a principle that I understood in the Marine Corps is we don't leave Americans behind. And I hope that the purported art of the deal, who should know a little bit about negotiation, is thinking about these 2 Americans as well as our troops as we figure out the best way forward. Mr. Ambassador, I'd also like to ask you about the importance of the special immigrant visa program that you stressed in your opening statement. I was proud to support an extension of the Afghan special immigrant visa program in the House version of the FY21 NDAA. We recognize the critical importance of the program for U.S. government operations in Afghanistan and also for future operations where young troops like I was are going to have to convince allies overseas to trust us enough to put their lives on the line to support us. So can you just tell us why the program is so critical in your eyes and the effect that the success of the program in Afghanistan will have on future national security operations overseas?
I think that is exactly right, Congressman. As I noted, there's a backlog of some 18,000 cases in Afghanistan. The sad reality is probably today more interpreters and their family members are getting killed in Afghanistan because of their service to us than are getting special immigrant visas to make good on our pledge to them that we would take care of them. And you are quite right. This has implications far beyond the borders of Afghanistan. The world is watching. The nature of war has changed. The wars of the future are going to look a little like this in the sense that we have got to have people from the community, from the nation, working with us. Otherwise, we're blind out there. And you know what that is like from your extraordinary service in Iraq.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Madam Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Keating, you have 5 minutes.
Sorry, couldn't hear that, Madam Chairman. Madam Chairman, who did you call on?
Mr. Keating, are you ready? You have 5 minutes.
Yes, I am. I couldn't hear my name.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you.
Very briefly, there's not a broad consensus today on exactly what we should do in terms of our troops in Afghanistan and their deployment, but there is a broad consensus on the fact that the way the administration is posing this drawdown is precipitous, and it's disagreed with, I think, by virtually everyone that's spoken today. It's pretty clear that one of the reasons that it undercuts the so-called peace plan, where there's a political date that was put on this, inauguration day for the drawdown. It also is one more example, a large one, of our inability to coordinate and respect our allies who have troops on the ground. This falls in the heels of dealing with the pullout after discussions with President Erdogan in Syria so quickly, without notice, adequate notice certainly, hours I heard in questioning to our allies about that decision. Pullouts from Germany of the troops there, another political decision on the heels of the G7 pullout by the Chancellor of Germany, and also the political switching of funds from things like the European Deterrence Initiative. So these abound, let alone our inability to consult with them on our allies on the INF Treaty or the JCPO decisions. I mean, this is a critical problem. I was in discussions just in the last few days with our allies, private discussions, and their concern for the way that this has been decided, their lack of consultation is profound. But I want to just quickly go on a couple of other issues that we haven't dealt with directly, I don't think. The danger of this pullout and the timing, the contracted nature of it with troop safety. This isn't the longer term issue of force protection, but actually moving our troops safely out in such a tight time frame. Also, the protection of our military assets, billions of dollars of assets that could fall into terrorist hands as a result of this artificial time frame. And also, the third thing, justification because of our situation with Pakistan, a very complicated issue. But how exactly can troop deployment there help us with Pakistan as opposed to our increasing inability to deal with them directly? So those are the issues, the troop safety short-term, asset protection short-term, and exactly how this is going to benefit our position strategically with problems in Pakistan. I will throw it open probably first to Dr. Jones.
Thank you very much for the questions. On the danger of pullout and the safety issue, you do raise very important questions. I think the Taliban has shown over the last couple of months since the February deal that it is significantly decreased. In fact, it's generally stopped targeting U.S. forces in Afghanistan. It is targeting Afghan forces, but not U.S. So I would not expect the Taliban to take advantage of this opportunity. But as we've already noted during this committee hearing, we have other groups, including the Islamic State Khorasan province, that continue to conduct attacks. So I think there are issues related to the safe withdrawal in spite or in the face of groups like the Islamic State that may conduct attacks. I do think there also has to be very serious questions about what are we doing with American assets, infrastructure in the country. The U.S. has poured large amounts of money. What is going to happen? Who's going to get it, including who's going to be in the bases that the U.S. is also downsizing. On Pakistan, just very briefly, I think Pakistan almost certainly believes this is a win for it. Its ally, the Taliban, is likely to advance with the continuing U.S. drawdown. So I see this as largely viewed positively by Islamabad.
Great. Thank you. I've got 30 seconds left. I'll yield back so my colleagues can ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Carvajal? Mr. Carvajal, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Ambassador Crocker, we have been in Afghanistan for almost 2 decades. While I'm concerned with the administration's recent unilateral announcement to draw down U.S. troops to 2,500 in January, we cannot be in an open-ended war. How can the U.S. better assist diplomatically and militarily in addressing the main barriers that are inhibiting an intra-Afghan agreement? And I know you briefly have touched on this, but if you could elaborate, I would greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, Congressman. Your question was broken up with my technical problems, but I think I have the gist of it. Again, it is an issue of strategic patience, of a long-term view. The Taliban certainly has it. They spent all those years in exile rather than give up their Al-Qaeda colleagues. They know they can. They believe they can outweight us, and the course of these so-called peace talks would, I think, vindicate that. It's, you know, I know about being tired, Congressman. I spent the 7 out of the first 11 years after 9/11 in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iraq. I was ambassador to all 3, so I get that too. I get it that the American people are tired. But getting tired and giving up need to be 2 different things. And I just pray that it is not too late to reverse the disastrous course we are on right now. That is simply running up the white flag, and we will pay for it down the line, not just in Afghanistan.
Ambassador, if you could just touch on what concrete steps we could do to create that intra agreement.
Well, first, we need to make it clear that we are not neutral in this matter, that the Afghan government has our solid backing, that we are not going to abandon an ally to the Taliban. That would be the first and critical, I think, concrete thing we can do. And then from that, making it clear that anything we do further is going to be strictly based on conditions. We will maintain our presence as long as the government wants us and as long as we need to defend our own national security interests. We need, in short, to demonstrate some strategic patience, and we need to do it now.
Thank you, Ambassador. Dr. Jones, as is well known, part of the U.S.-Taliban deal negotiated by the Trump administration was the Taliban's commitment to prevent Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups from using Afghan soil to threaten the U.S. or its allies, including by preventing recruiting, training, and fundraising. There is a grave concern and apprehension that the Taliban are not and will not uphold that commitment. Looking forward, how do we measure the extent to which the Taliban fulfills this part of the agreement?
It's a very good question, Congressman. I think the answer in part hinges on our intelligence collection and analysis capabilities. To what degree do we continue to see meetings? That's from human intelligence and signals intelligence, meetings between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. To what degree do we see Al-Qaeda continue to operate in areas where there are Taliban commanders? To what degree do we see Al-Qaeda and other camps operating in Afghanistan or along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border? There are obviously a range of ways, including through geospatial intelligence, that we can monitor that. It does become harder the more we drop in forces, though, it makes it more difficult for NSA and CIA to put their important units and collection sites because they use the military for those. So the more we withdraw, the harder it becomes to see that.
Thank you. I have limited time. Dr. Biddle, in your testimony, you discussed how the Afghan National Defense and the security forces need to be professionalized to root out corruption. What can the United States do and our allies to support these efforts?
There's a limited amount that we can do, actually, because the corruption and cronyism we see is so deeply rooted in fundamental political features of the Afghan governing system. What we can do, however, is to reach a low ceiling, and I think the key to that is conditionality in the aid that we provide. We need to tell the Afghans what we expect in exchange for our support that can move their incentives, albeit gradually, in the direction of professionalization. We should do that, but we should also be realistic about how much we can accomplish on that score.
Thank you very much. I'm out of time. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Kim, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Dr. Jones, I'm going to start with you. I would thank you for taking some time to be able to come here. And I was reading through an October interview that you conducted with now Acting Secretary of Defense Chris Miller, I guess, in October. And he mentioned 3 lessons learned in the CT fight. One is that we have to maintain pressure on the terrorist organizations so that they cannot create sanctuaries. Number 2, that you don't let states fail. And then 3, bad policies do not get better with age. And I wanted to just kind of think through, with these 3 counterterrorism lessons in mind, I wanted to get your reflections upon the decision that he is taking part in with regards to Afghanistan, what your thoughts are on each of those 3 levels and whether or not those conditions have been met in Afghanistan.
Well, let me begin with the importance of maintaining pressure. I think the 2500 does allow us to continue to pressure al-Qaeda and some terrorist groups, including the Islamic State, in Afghanistan. So I do think a complete withdrawal would have eliminated our ability to maintain pressure against terrorist organizations. Having some special operations forces and some aircraft does allow us to keep pressure. But I do think going down to the levels that we are does cause us to risk the broader counterinsurgency campaign. So I think we're taking risk. I'm not sure I would have recommended that to go down to 2,500, but I do think we still can maintain some pressure with the size force we have. I don't think we want to let Afghanistan fail. And again, part of the issue is not just the military footprint. Part of it is also the aid that we need to provide. And one of the things that I recommended, Mr. Kim, in my testimony, in my written testimony, was also to make it very clear to the Afghan government that we are going to provide sustained assistance to that government, like we do in other countries, and that we would be a supporting partner in the next several years. So I think the issue is not to focus just on military forces, but what are we doing in terms of State Department and U.S. Agency for International Development Assistance? What are we doing on the intelligence aid side? That stuff has not been clear. So I'd actually like to hear more clarity on what non-military types of assistance are happening.
Well, absolutely, and as would I. And as a former State Department official that worked in Afghanistan about 10 years ago, and then also I visited Afghanistan with a number of my colleagues in a bipartisan group a year ago. These are the exact same questions that were heard, which is what is that comprehensive strategy? What is the actual way in which we work in this way in a civ-mil fashion here? And I want to turn to Ambassador Crocker. Ambassador, you were the ambassador in Afghanistan when I was there in 2011, and I always appreciated your leadership out there. And I wanted to focus in on what you said about NATO. You were talking about how NATO is coming up with a different approach, or they have different opinions there. I wanted to ask you if you could give us a little bit more detail into any reflections you have, any communication you've had with NATO partners or other countries about how they're seeing this situation and why it is that they seem to have a longer horizon and approach this, and also just conclude, what is your assessment of the state of the NATO alliance and thoughts there in terms of how we need to prepare?
Thank you, Congressman. NATO made it clear during the time I was there, and I do remember your visit. Thank you for making that effort. It is so important to come out and see things on the ground for yourself, as you did. Our NATO allies, as you know, stood up for us on Article 5. I have been pleasantly surprised of their willingness to make the long-term commitment they have in Afghanistan. They are ready to stay as long as we are staying. But we would delude ourselves utterly to think they're going to stay if we're going. And I think that is the hinge point we're at right now after the president's drawdown decision that did not involve consultations with NATO. I believe very strongly that the NATO alliance is critical for global security as well as America's security. We have all had frustrations with NATO, both in terms of financial commitments and capabilities. Here is one arena where they are ready to
Ambassador,
stand,
unfortunately, my
ready to
time has
stay.
expired here, so I'm going to have to yield back to the chairman, but thank you for your assessments there.
Thank you very much. Ms. Horn is recognized for 5 minutes.
I'll yield back my time. I just walked in. Thank you, Chairman.
Okay. At this point, I don't think we have anyone else seeking time. I have one last question for Ambassador Crocker, and I think this is sort of the crux of the problem, and certainly we understand the risks, and they've been very well explained, of what can happen in Afghanistan. And, you know, those risks go up to some extent if we aren't present trying to contain them. But when you talked about, and this is, you know, a very long-held belief by many people, that after the Soviets were driven out of Afghanistan, our decision to not stay engaged and the impact of that, you know a lot more about Afghanistan than I do. I've been there 8 or 9 times, but not for any length, and certainly not in the depth that you have. But if you were to take me, you know, back to that moment, and then, you know, knowing what we know now, I just don't think us staying would have solved the problem. And I think that's what a lot of people are, you know, wrestling with. Is
connectivity.
I'm sorry, Ambassador Crocker, are you hearing me? Okay. Yeah, I'll take that as a no. So I guess I know we've got Dr. Jones and Dr. Biddle here. If you could answer this question, my point is, and we've heard it described, and I forget, I think it was Dr. Jones who was making the points about you got all the warlords, and if the government gets too powerful, the warlords get upset, and you have to appease them. You certainly have got the drug trade, you've got extremists. Everyone in Afghanistan owns 10 guns. And after the Soviets came in, it really blew up the existing government. You had the funding of the madrasas that came out of Saudi Arabia into Pakistan, which radicalized a large portion of the population. Can we honestly say that there was something we could have done in 1989 that would have changed that? And I think that's what concerns a lot of people, is here we are saying, oh, there's a huge problem here, and if we show up, we'll solve it. That just doesn't seem to play out. There are certain things that U.S. military in foreign countries just can't come in and solve. And the idea that, you know, gosh, if we leave, everything's going to go to hell, it is an enormous cost. Certainly, you know, in lives, in the risk of lives, in the disruption of lives of American service members and others who serve there. But it's also a global cost in terms of our credibility and other. While we're doing that, what else can't we be doing? All right. And again, you know, we got U.S. troops killing Afghans. All right. There's going to be a certain amount of resentment amongst the Afghan people for that. So I guess how can you answer the question of, are we as Americans, with the military, really able to solve these incredibly complex problems that exist in Afghanistan? Because I think most people's impression is that's the folly, is thinking that somehow, oh, if we were just there in greater numbers and if we were just there a little bit smarter, we could achieve some sort of peace deal. So I don't know what the connectivity stuff's going on here. So Dr. Jones, you're sitting in front of me. I'm going to let you take a stab at that.
Very good questions, and I do think it's important to look at the history of the country, including the 1980s. I would say the U.S. position today is very different than what it was in the 1980s, where we were actually in Pakistan. We were not in Afghanistan, where we were providing assistance to the Mujahideen. So I don't...
But what I'm really talking about, actually, sorry, I garbled that because I got confused in terms of what was going on with the connectivity there. I'm talking about when it was done. And that's, that's Charlie Wilson's war. That was the great lament of it. Gosh, we pulled out and everything went to hell. If only we had gone in, it would have been fixed. And that's what I don't believe, to be honest with you.
Well, I would take the one lesson that we did not do that we could have done is kept a close intelligence and probably a special operations presence embedded with Northern Alliance forces, which were still surviving at the end of the 1990s. And we could have, and I think the 9/11 Commission report highlights this, we could have conducted attacks against bin Laden at that point. We did not. We did not pull the trigger. The Clinton administration had bin Laden within its sights. So I think having a presence there would have allowed us to conduct some action. I think
on that one quick point, though, there are risks in doing what you just described, okay? Because that is the risk of inaction, okay? We've taken actions before. We bombed that, pharmaceutical plant in Sudan, which, blew up in our face. We did launch a bunch of cruise missiles in to try to take out bin Laden. So I think there's a tendency to say inaction bad, action good, or action bad. I mean, it's more of a balance depending on the circumstances, and there's risks either way.
Yes, I think there are risks either way, and I think that's where we're at today. Do we take the risk of leaving and seeing what happens afterwards, or can we accept some small military presence, some aid, and keep the Afghan government and the Taliban talking and prevent the overthrow, at least for the next couple of years, and see where this goes? And that's what my advice is to consider.
Understood. And just to conclude, I mean, I believe that there is still a transnational terrorist threat. And when we talk about the shift to great power competition, we need to get out of this stuff and everything. I know the challenges that are presented by Russia and China, but I think it is important that we all keep in mind that there's still only one group of people that gets up every morning hoping to kill as many Americans and Westerners as they possibly can. And the only thing that's stopping them is the ability to do it. It's not a lack of will. And that is Al-Qaeda and ISIS and various affiliated groups all over the world. We will have to do something, in my view, to contain that threat. And I think those who wish it away and say, gosh, if we just weren't fighting them, they'd just stop hating us, that's not going to work. Something needs to be done to contain that threat. I think what the American people are trying to figure out is how can we do that in a way that is less costly and places fewer troops at risk, and I think that's what we have to work towards. This is horribly unfair, but believe it or not, Mac, we're wrapping up.
Well, Mr. Chairman, if I do have
I say that because Mr. Thornberry just walked back into the room, by the way. Mr. I'm sorry, Mac. Mr. Thornberry, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Well, no, I just had a brief question based on some earlier conversation. Ms. Stefanik was asking you, Dr. Jones, about force protection. And I know that Dr. Biddle had talked about two sources of leverage. One is the presence of our troops. The other is our financial commitment. The concern has been expressed to me that if we unilaterally make significant cuts to our financial commitment, it could endanger our forces who are there in some way because that leverage, that incentive would be reduced. Do you have an opinion about that?
Yeah, I think the answer to that depends, Mr. Thornberry, on what types of assistance were cut, but I certainly think training to local forces, particularly if it starts to trigger some animosity. We've seen attacks against U.S. forces from Afghans as the situation deteriorates. That would be a concern. But I also think, are we cutting key resources that protect our forces on the bases where we operate? And I think that needs to be looked at very closely.
Yeah, well, whatever the number, 25, 45, it's not many folks, and we depend upon the Afghans to protect our folks by and large, and it just seems to me to be a key consideration. Finally, Mr. Chairman, I'd just say I really appreciate all three witnesses and their testimony and their bearing with us today. I think it's been very helpful. I yield back.
Thank you. We did have a couple more members who came back in since we concluded there. So we'll go with Ms. Spear first, and then Ms. Torres Small, and then we will adjourn. Ms. Spear, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you especially for this hearing. It's been very insightful. To all of the witnesses, extraordinary testimony. To Ambassador Crocker, what a lifetime of contributions you've made to our country. I'm not sure if it was you, Ambassador, or someone else, but someone said we are going to pay for it if we leave abruptly. And I'd like for someone, whoever said that, to define what is paying for it means.
Ms. Spear?
Yes.
I'm sorry. Ambassador Crocker, are you still with us? It sounds like we've lost our connection to Ambassador
Okay.
Crocker.
So maybe to Dr. Biddle and Dr. Jones, an abrupt withdrawal. I mean, we've seen what has happened, certainly in Iraq. I worry about the reinstatement of Sharia law and the impacts on women and children. And I worry that we have to calibrate what a presence, a presence that will be relevant is. Is 2,500 enough, or do we need 4,000? Can we reinstate the other 2,000 after the Biden administration comes into operation, if that is where he's inclined to go? If you could just kind of, in your own words, kind of answer those 2 or 3 questions. And let's start with you, Dr. Biddle.
I would personally like to see the withdrawal order remanded, and I'd like our current troop level to remain at least through the beginning of a Biden administration, in part for the political issue of bargaining leverage in the talks, but in part because our Afghan allies do continue to depend, especially on the airstrikes that the U.S. presence provides. If we were to totally withdraw, which I think is a defensible view if you think the talks are hopeless, but if we were to totally withdraw, I think it's very likely that the Afghan National Security Forces would break. They're taking heavy casualties in combat already. There are serious strains on the organization. If we were to leave, that would signal them that the future is very negative. And the combat motivation of the remaining troops would be affected in a very dangerous way by a perception that this is now a hopeless enterprise, and that sooner or later they're looking at failure and defeat in the absence of U.S. support. I think the signal that would send to the Afghan security forces is likely to cause them to be unable to sustain the stalemate that we now see.
Thank you, Dr. Jones.
Yes, I did not use the words pay for it, but what I would say is that at the moment we have something close to a military stalemate in Afghanistan and a rough balance of power. The Afghan government on the one side with some support from the U.S. and other NATO countries, and on the other we have the Taliban with some support from Pakistan, from Iran, from Russia, and from some other outside donors. You break that balance by a complete withdrawal. So you shift the balance in favor of the Taliban. And I think as all of us have noted during this hearing, that the Taliban continues to have relations with al-Qaeda. I think it becomes only a matter of time before the Taliban starts to overrun major cities in Kandahar, Helmand, Farah, and other provinces. And I think then the concern is that we start to see. That's my concern.
I apologize for that. Ms. Spear, you still have time. Go ahead.
Was that Dr. Jones speaking or Ambassador Crocker?
That was Dr. Jones speaking.
Okay. And I guess Ambassador Crocker cannot connect. All right. I guess my final question, if I still have time, Mr. Chairman, is there anything that hasn't been asked this morning that any of you would like to inform us about that we should be looking at that maybe has not been discussed?
I'm getting a head shake.
Well,
and it's going to have to be quick. Apologize. She's almost out of time. Go ahead.
I'll just take the opportunity then. What I would suggest is this whole exercise tells us that it's very important to think of the termination of a war when you begin a war. If we engage in any of these kinds of interventions in the future, we need from the beginning to assume not that the war just ends when you conquer the capital, but that there's going to be some subsequent process that we need to think through in advance. If we had understood that in 2001 to 2 and negotiated the Taliban when we had the opportunity and the advantage, rather than assuming that we had won the war because the capital had fallen, I don't think we would now be in this situation. The easiest way to prevent the kind of dilemmas we face now is to solve them at the beginning. When we get involved, when we understand what our war aims are, and when we accept the idea that negotiation is a way to realize our war aims at the beginning is a better solution than waging a 20-year war and then finding yourself with no good options in the end.
Thank you. Mr. Arsenal is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. I wanted to follow up on Congressman Kim's question regarding the impact that that this scaled withdrawal would impact on our allies. So can you just, Dr. Jones, I'd love to hear your sense about how our allies, what position our allies would put in, both NATO and non-NATO, given this reduction in forces.
Well, I think there were two challenges. One is, and I think we saw it with the reaction of the NATO Secretary General, they were not given sufficient advanced warning, so that what it didn't include was a broader U.S., NATO, and other forces. What are their objectives, combined objectives? What are the force postures collectively that they need, and how does this affect all of that? So I did not see a lot of strategic planning with our allies. The second issue is, remember, there is pressure, and there should be pressure in all of our allies' capitals and among their populations with people that are asking, why do the Germans still have forces, the Italians, the British, and others, why do they still have forces in Afghanistan? So I think the recognition here is if we want those countries to continue to train and to continue to engage in combat operations, we have to treat them as allies, plan with them as allies, and that's the only way I think we're able to keep it. Because I think they provide advantages. They have forces on the ground. They can train Afghan forces, and I think that at the end of the day, this shows that it's not just us.
Earlier in discussions, we talked about the potential impact that the removal of troops or the drawdown of troops would have on negotiations for peace. And I wanted to link those two discussions together. The need for us to strategically plan with our allies and the potential domino effect that our reduction of troops could have on other presence, our allies' presence on the ground, and how that might impact negotiations, especially given changing relationships, perhaps heightened tensions with our allies.
Is that directed at me?
Yes, sorry.
Okay. I think it's a very good question. I think when you look at this from the Taliban's perspective, they agreed to start negotiations in September. Those negotiations have gone nowhere. They have dragged their feet. And now they perceive they have been rewarded for dragging their feet by further U.S. drawdown that was not connected in any way to progress on the peace settlement. So I think the issue here is if we want an actual peace agreement, then no one can be rewarded for this.
Just specifically on the point of our relationship with NATO and non-NATO allies, is there anything more you'd say in terms of that impact on potential
collaboration and strategy, as you mentioned, for the peace negotiations?
Well, I think the addition of international forces is also an important bargaining chip in the negotiations. Not just U.S. forces leaving, as we've talked about. It's also other international forces leaving. That's an important note here.
Thank you. And I don't know if we still have Ambassador Crocker, but if he wanted to weigh in on this, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you. I think I'm reconnected.
You are.
Ultimately, this is not about force levels. It's about American resolve. And that resolve has been very sadly wanting, going all the way back to the inception of these talks that excluded the Afghan government. That is the decision we need to make as a country. All of us in different ways, all three of us have said, we are in a very dangerous situation right now, and that further unlinked troop withdrawals are going to make it worse. Our great strength as a nation has been based on many things. One of them are our alliances. NATO is crucial. We have an opportunity here. We need to seize it. But first, we need to stop the bleeding, literally. And second, we have to have a conversation among ourselves and with our allies. This is not a lost cause if we demonstrate that resolve.
Thank you. I yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you. We do have one more member who has returned, and then that is it, no matter who comes back. Ms. Houlihan, you will have the last 5 minutes of the hearing. You're up.
Thank you, and I hope that you all can hear me. My question is for Dr. Biddle. The United States was committed to a conditions-based drawdown, as we've just heard from several people asking questions. And your written testimony says that the expectations on the part of the Afghanis for U.S. engagements were central to the ability to negotiate an acceptable settlement to the war. I was just wondering, in your view, what would moving away from our publicly touted conditions-based approach, especially on the eve of a transition of government here in the United States, signal to the Afghan people? And what does it mean for our ability to credibly facilitate inter-Afghan negotiations in the future?
I think during the Trump administration, the view of many Afghans was that we were simply headed out regardless of what happened. The conditions-based language wasn't to be taken seriously and wasn't to be trusted. And that in turn made it very, very difficult for the Afghan government to persuade members of its own political coalition that they should accept compromises in order to get a deal, because it looked like the half-life of the entire Afghan government was going to be very, very limited. And hence asking power brokers within the Afghan elite at large to make near-term sacrifices for a long-term better Afghanistan, when total U.S. cut and run looked like it was going to create a long-term in Afghanistan measured in minutes, months, years at most, didn't look like a good bargain. That in turn made it very, very difficult for them to organize any kind of consistent bargaining position vis-a-vis the Taliban. Now, an incoming Biden administration is going to have an opportunity to make its own decisions about how seriously it takes these talks, to what degree they're prepared to use the leverage we have remaining to bring about successful talks. Among the many difficulties in this talks is that there are so many parties. We tend to think of it as the Taliban and the U.S. It's actually the Taliban and the Afghan government, but the Afghan government is not a unified actor. And in terms of the Afghan government's ability to get a consistent position among all the different actors internally to its side of these talks, some degree of understood consistency in U.S. support for the Afghan government is critical for enabling the Afghan leadership to persuade elements of its own political coalition that it makes sense for them to be in this for the long haul. If we signal to them that we're not in it for the long haul, the stability of their own government goes way down. The ability of that unstable government to command enough loyalty and cooperation from its own power brokers to make concessions in a compromise talks goes way down. These are issues that the Biden administration now has an opportunity to recast. I hope they will take that opportunity.
And that my next question is somewhat related to that. Assuming that the Biden administration gets that opportunity, what kind of conditions, if any, do you think need to be met before the U.S. would consider reducing or withdrawing troops further, assuming that it were a Biden administration or even what remains of this administration?
I would like to see further withdrawals conditioned on an end to the war. mean, if that's our strategy for getting out of this with an acceptable outcome, the way we use our resources needs to be tied to that outcome. If an end to the war is what we want, and that's what we should want, then we should be prepared to leave the small number of troops that are there now. I mean, this isn't the almost 100,000 soldier presence of 2011 anymore. This is a rather small footprint to begin with. I think we should be prepared to say we were going to leave it there until we get what we want, which is an end to the war through a negotiated settlement.
And that actually is, you must be kind of reading my mind. My next question is what kind of troops should remain? And what kind of troops would you recommend that we remain what in terms of personnel? And I have about a minute left, sir.
I would recommend leaving every single American soldier who's there now there until the war ends. Now, in terms of the configuration of what's there, I suspect it's pretty close to optimized now because I have confidence in General Miller and his ability to design his force structure to be optimal with respect to the cap that he's given. In terms of the military capabilities that go along with the political role of driving us towards a settlement, the critical military capability at the moment is airstrikes. Our ability to do airstrikes effectively rests in turn on how many bases we can maintain in the country and how much cooperation we can get with Afghan Corps headquarters to enable us to know where Afghan forces are, what they're doing, what they're seeing, and thus how we can support them with our air power. The way I would evaluate in military terms the size and configuration of a posture which in my view is primarily valued for political purposes, would be centrally how does it affect our ability to deliver air power to keep our Afghan allies militarily effective in the field to the extent that we can do it. That's the criterion I would use in evaluating the makeup of that posture.
Perfect. I very much appreciate your time, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. And I want to join the ranking member in thanking our witnesses for this discussion. Appreciate you being here. Appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us. And with that, we are adjourned.
Thank you very much.